Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Drunk Agile. Very coincidentally, I think, Prateek, you and I are wearing exactly the same thing that we wore last week. That's
Yeah, the thing is, everyone can tell that we're wearing the same thing, but no one can tell if Nisha's doing the same thing.
yeah. She looks suspiciously in the same position, but who really knows? Maybe compare her position in the last video to
Should have hidden this
should
book.
yeah, because we promise a week has passed
Yeah,
since the last one we recorded and
yeah.
this one. So we mentioned the start of the show. Nisha, thank you very much for being here. Along with Nisha, we have, unfortunately,
Saying,
Prateek.
yeah.
Thank you for being here. Prateek's drinking the same thing. I'm drinking the same thing. Let's kind of jump.
For reference, look at
Yeah,
the previous episode.
let's jump right. So in the last week's video, we talked exclusively about the flaw of averages. In this week's video, we want to talk about some implementations of the flaw of averages where you may not think it's the flaw of averages, but there's probably the flaw of averages lurking somewhere underneath the covers. So I'd like to kick us off by reading a question from a question that I got today from Matt. I'm not going to give his last name, but it's a great question. I mean, I could give his last name because it's a very, very good question, but we'll protect the innocent because I don't know if Matt wants us to use his last name or not. But here's Matt's question. What are your thoughts on using standard deviation of cycle time in terms of looking at a team's performance or predictability? My understanding is that standard deviation only works when you have a normal distribution and is meaningless when the data follows something different. Cycle time data tends to follow more of a Weibull or Weibull or however you pronounce that distribution, not a normal one. Thoughts? Unfortunately for Matt, there's almost nothing correct in anything that he's said here. Don't get me wrong, it's a great question. It's a great question. And I love that he is verbalizing probably 2 or 3 huge myths out there about standard deviations, out there about how cycle time is distributed, about all this. So we're going to try and cover as much of that as possible, keeping in mind that lurking underneath the covers for a lot of this stuff is the flaw of averages. So Prateek, can you kick us off? What are your thoughts on using standard deviation of cycle time for looking at predictability?
So let's start from the last part of that question, which where Matt talks about cycle time data following a normal distribution, not following a normal distribution, but instead following a Weibull or however you call it distribution. That is where Matt's getting to the heart of the problem, but missing it by just a little bit there. The heart of the problem is that when you are trying to use these traditional methods, you kind of need to know what the underlying distribution is before making judgment calls using these methods. And
Which method?
sorry.
To be clear, which methods are you talking
Oh,
about? Be very clear
using
what.
yeah, sorry, using things like averages and standard distribution, standard deviations, and then doing the whole, if it's outside of 2 sigma or if it's outside of 3 sigma, there are things we need to look at. When you're doing those kind of statistical methods, applying those, you do need to know what that distribution is underneath. Unfortunately, not only do we usually not know what the distribution is underneath, it also shifts. The distribution itself shifts as you get more data, as you get live data, live cycle time data. That is the basis of the problem. I don't think Matt's trying to necessarily ask a bad question, as you said. It's just there are those assumptions underneath, which he's exposing might be a problem.
So let's be very, very clear. There is no distribution on Earth, normal, viable, dear God, Wakeby, whatever. There is no distribution on Earth that will describe your cycle time data. Now, I know that probably flies in the face of some things that you've heard, maybe from even the Kanban community, but there is absolutely no distribution on Earth that describes your cycle time data for your process, which is one of the reasons why we talk about you have to use your data for your process and throw out a lot of these steam error statistics, which we'll talk about talk about here in a second. So that's, that's point number one, right? The absolute last thing you want to do is try to take your cycle time data, fit it to one of these well-known distributions, and then start performing fancy statistics on that, because that will get you into trouble very, very quickly. For more information on that, again, Dr. Donald Wheeler is probably the best source on that. Do you have something to say about that before we go to standard deviation specifically?
No, let's go to standard deviation. That's where I was going. So yeah.
Okay, good. Now, the second part of this, which is really was really the first part of his question, is, can you use standard deviation for predictability? And this is something that I think what he's getting at is something that most people want to do when they calculate an average and standard deviation for their data. Is they might want to do, if they're doing a two-tail test or whatever, they will either do an average plus one standard deviation and minus one standard deviation if that's for two-tail, and they'll say, hey, roughly 68% of our dots should fall within that. Plus one, minus one. Roughly, I don't know, what is it? 95% is plus two and minus two, and roughly 99%.
99 is plus
three and minus three. And what Matt says correctly is when you put those exact percentages on there, you are absolutely assuming that you have a normal distribution, which, as we just said, you don't. Now, that in and of itself, that doesn't mean you can't use a standard deviation, because there is something out there, if anybody's interested, and this is a segue, but you might be interested in this. There is something out there called an empirical rule. And again, Dr. Wheeler talks about this. I just want to read it very quickly, and then we can talk about how it applies or maybe doesn't apply here. There are three parts to the empirical rule. Part one, roughly 60 to 75% of your data will be found within the interval defined by the average plus or minus the standard deviation statistic. Now, when we say that, plus or minus the standard deviation statistic, we are talking about for any distribution, regardless of how the underlying data is distributed. The empirical rule says roughly 60 to 75% of your data will be found within the interval plus one or minus one. Roughly 90 to 98% of the data will be found within two standard deviations, plus or minus two standard deviations. That's part two. And part three is approximately 99 to 100% of the data will be found within the interval defined by the average plus or minus three standard deviations. So the fact that your data is not normally distributed does not necessarily discount using the standard deviation because of the empirical rule. However, right, from a predictability perspective, everything that I just told you means almost nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
Almost nothing. I know, Prateek. So can you get into why that might?
Yeah. None of that will help you communicate anything to your customers. If 99% of your data is in this range, it doesn't necessarily, because your standard deviation could be such lengths off that it's whether your process, I want to take a step back, whether your process runs such that everything gets done in 10 days or less, or your process runs such that everything gets done in 100 days or less, the empirical rule applies. So from a predictability perspective, you're not gaining anything using standard deviation.
So that's, to me, that's kind of point number one that you should make, that we should make. Just by, if you review what I said about the empirical rule, probably the very first litmus test that you should be running on your data is, does it follow the empirical rule? Because if your data does not follow the empirical rule, then you do not have a predictable process. You can almost be guaranteed you don't have a predictable process. In fact, you've probably got 3 or 4 or even dozens of processes running all at the same time, because your data doesn't follow the empirical rule. So that's litmus test. But then number two, even if your data follows the empirical rule, and we say we want to start using standard deviations, for me, this is where I wanted to bring the flaw of averages back into it, is, whenever we talking about the average and a standard deviation, both of those statistics are easily influenced by extreme outliers. Right? The classic joke that we like to talk about. I don't know who's the richest person in the world now. It's not Elon Musk. Oh, it's the Louis Vuitton.
The French guy?
Yeah, whatever his
Yeah.
name is. I don't know. So congratulations to you.
I try not to speak French because
Yeah.
French people start throwing stuff at me when I say
Whatever, whatever his name is, because Elon Musk just lost $200 billion in a month or something like that. What couldn't happen to a worse guy. But anyway, when the Louis Vuitton guy walks into a pub, on average, everybody in that pub is a billionaire. When this is kind of what we talked about before, if you were to go up and talk to anybody in that pub that wasn't that dude, they would not be a billionaire, right? It's the classic case of the flaw of averages. Averages are very, very easily influenced by extreme outliers. Standard deviations, same thing. So now if you have an extreme outlier in your data, not only is your average going to be inflated, but your standard deviation is going to be inflated as well, which is going to give you a very, very, very false sense of predictability. Sorry, we're gonna jump in and say something there?
No, the other thing that I was kind of going to add to that, another point of our data is also zero bound. When we're talking about cycle time or throughput, it's zero bound. So our distribution, if there is a distribution you try to apply to it, it has an abrupt end, and that makes it even harder to apply some of these standard quote unquote statistics. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, two, at least two, maybe more overall problems when we start talking about averages and standard deviation. Number one, if anybody starts throwing specific percentages out at you, say, oh, it's within this plus or minus one standard deviation, so therefore we're at 68% or whatever it is. Again, they are assuming you have a normally distributed data set when almost certainly, I always say this, I'll bet Prateek's life that your data is not normally distributed. It almost certainly is. But then your fallback is the empirical rule. But then again, even if your data falls within the empirical rule, that tells you absolutely nothing about the predictability of your process. All that really tells you is that you potentially have a stable system, right? So something that we can start describing in other ways. That's where we need to see our future series on process behavior charts.
Behavior charts, yeah.
Yeah, and things like that. So yeah. And then the second thing is you might say, well, okay, well, I acknowledge that our data is not normally distributed. So let's fit our data to a probability model and start doing, start figuring out shape parameters and skewness and kurtosis and all this stuff. And we can make predictions based on that stuff. Wrong as well, because your data will not fit any of those models. It just won't. At best, it'll be an approximation. Sorry if I can say one more. I know I'm talking a lot this episode. I don't care. Dr. Wheeler says this all the time. When he says your data is at best an approximation, and what he means by that, and what he says he means by that is, you could have an infinite data points, an infinite amount of data points, and you would still never be able to prove that your data set matched one of these probabilities exactly. It only takes one data point to prove that your data does not match one of those things. So anyway, that's the last thing I wanted to say for now.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull it back to Dr. Sam Savage, and we mentioned this very briefly early on, steam error statistics. The reason these distributions even exist is because they were used as approximations when we did not have the ability to collect the data, when we did not have these computers that could collect every data point and present it to you. Now that we have the ability to get real data and use real data, there is no need to fall back to steam error statistics and to go through those distributions that are an approximation of the real thing that you already have.
Yep.
So as much as possible, use the real data.
If anybody wants to learn a lot more about the history of those steam error statistics, there's a book out there called Bernoulli's Fallacy. Maybe some of you in the audience have read it. I have a hard time recommending the book from the book's premise perspective. I'm not sure that the book itself fulfilled its premise, but from just a history lesson, because he does a great job of going into the history of these statistics and how most modern statistics are built on assumptions of 2 or 3 guys, and most of those assumptions are wrong, and not necessarily even applicable in our world. But because they needed mathematical shortcuts, because they didn't have computers, at the time, all this stuff became accepted as true statistics, when it was really essentially just three people's opinion, and I think it's really more one or two people's opinion. Anyway, go read the book. I'm not doing it justice, but if you want to learn more about that's a fascinating read from a history perspective.
No.
Okay, so moral of the story is law of averages sneak up on you when you least expect it. And even when you hear so-called experts out there telling you certain things, the first thing you need to think about, especially when it comes to, forecasting, data analysis, or whatever, is the flaw of averages lurking somewhere here in the shadows.
Yeah, and how can we stay as close and as true to the data that we have, the actual and discrete, because our data is discrete, the actual discrete data that we have, instead of trying to take mathematical shortcuts.
Yep. And we haven't even talked about transforming your data so that it is normal and doing all that kind of crap.
Yeah.
Because there are people who would even recommend that.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah.
That's,
just
might
don't.
as well use story points.
Yes, at that point. Yeah. And on that note, on the might as well use story points note, please tune in next time, where maybe this we have to tune in. Maybe we'll have dressed differently next time. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah. Who knows? So maybe I would actually finish a drink.
Be drinking something different. So for the star of the show, Nisha there in the background for Prateek Singh, I just want to say sorry for hogging this show, but hope you will join us next week or whenever we publish the next video. Good night, everybody.
Okay.